The soft morning light streamed through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the cozy bedroom. Amora stirred in her bed, her hand instinctively reaching for James beside her. He was already awake, propped up against the headboard, scrolling through his phone. His neatly trimmed beard framed a calm, smiling face as he glanced her way. "Good morning, sleepyhead," James said with a chuckle, leaning over to kiss her forehead. Amora stretched and smiled. "Morning. What time is it?" "Just past 8. "You deserve a slow start," he replied, setting his phone on the bedside table. "Coffee's brewing." Amora swung her legs off the bed, her silk nightgown brushing against her skin. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, a comforting reminder of their morning ritual. Life felt steady and predictable, a rhythm she had grown to cherish. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her gaze wandered to her phone on the counter. She hesitated before picking it up, scrolling through her call log. There it was, 5 missed calls to her mother, Mama Grace, all unanswered. "She still hasn't called back," Amora murmured, frowning. James appeared behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Amora, it's Grace. You know how she is. She probably got distracted, visiting some church group or helping a neighbor with something. That woman is like a whirlwind." Amora nodded, her fingers tapping lightly against her mug. "I know, but it's been over a week. That's unusual, even for her." "Maybe her phone's acting up again," James suggested, his tone light and reassuring. "She's always complaining about it. Don't overthink it." Amora sighed, letting herself lean into his embrace. James always had a way of calming her down. "You're probably right. I'll drop by her house this week just to check in." "Good idea," he said, planting a kiss on her temple. "Now, finish your coffee before it gets cold. I've got a meeting soon, and I can't have you worrying yourself all day." Amora managed a small smile and took a sip. Her unease lingered, a faint whisper in the back of her mind, but James's words were like a bomb. He had always been her rock, the one she leaned on when the world felt unsteady. If he wasn't worried, maybe she didn't need to be either. Later, as James gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave, he turned to her with a playful grin. "Don't start writing a mystery novel about your mother, okay? She's probably just fine." Amora chuckled, shaking her head. "I'll try." But as she stood by the window, watching James drive off, her thoughts drifted back to Mama Grace. The calls, the silence, the nagging feeling she couldn't quite shake, it was there, quietly gnawing at her. Yet, for now, she pushed it aside, reassuring herself that life, as it seemed, was still perfect. Amora parked her car in the familiar driveway of her mother's modest home. The vibrant flower beds that Mama Grace loved to tend to so dearly were overgrown, the vibrant marigolds and hibiscus wilting from neglect. It was unusual, her mother never let her garden go untended. A knot formed in Amora's stomach as she stepped out of the car. She knocked on the front door, waiting for the familiar sound of her mother's footsteps shuffling to greet her. Instead, there was silence. She knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Mama." "It's me, Amora." The house remained eerily quiet. Amora pulled the spare key from her bag and let herself in, her footsteps echoing slightly in the stillness. The air inside felt stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in days. The living room looked mostly normal at first glance, the neatly arranged sofa, the framed family photos on the mantel, but then her eyes fell on a duffel bag sitting near the couch. It was partially packed, clothes spilling out onto the floor. Her brows knitted together. Mama Grace was meticulous, never one to leave things half done. Amora crouched to inspect the bag, recognizing some of her mother's church dresses folded neatly inside. "Were you planning to leave, Mama?" she murmured under her breath. Rising to her feet, Amora moved into the kitchen, hoping to find some clue about where her mother might have gone. The sight on the counter stopped her in her tracks. Her mother's old flip phone lay there, the screen dark. Amora picked it up and pressed the power button, but the phone remained unresponsive. Dead. Mama Grace never went anywhere without her phone. It was practically glued to her hip, even if she grumbled about its outdated technology. Amora's heart sank further as she looked around the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly, its surface covered in family photos and handwritten notes. One of the notes caught her attention. In her mother's neat handwriting, it simply read, "Amora's house, Saturday at 3 p.m. She frowned. The date was over a week ago. Her mother hadn't mentioned visiting her house recently. Amora's mind raced as she tried to recall that day. She had been home, but it had been a quiet weekend, nothing out of the ordinary, or so she thought. A sudden knock at the door startled her, making her jump. Amora hurried to answer it, finding Mrs. Odelai, the elderly neighbor who lived next door, standing on the porch with a concerned look on her face. Dressed in her usual colorful headscarf and flowing gown, Mrs. Odelai held a watering can in one hand. "Oh, Amora, it's you," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "I've been wondering when someone would come by." "Hello, Mrs. Odelai," Amora replied, forcing a smile. "I'm just here checking on Mama. Have you seen her recently?" The older woman's expression darkened. "Not since last week." "She stopped by your house, didn't she?" Amora's stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" "It was last Saturday, in the afternoon," Mrs. Odelai said, leaning closer as if to share a secret. "I saw her going into your house. I thought it was odd because, well," she hesitated. "Because what?" Amora pressed, her voice sharper than she intended. "Because I heard loud voices coming from inside," Mrs. Odelai confessed, lowering her voice. "It sounded like an argument, but I didn't want to interfere. You know how your mother can be when she's upset." Amora's breath caught. An argument. At her house. The timeline didn't make sense. If Mama Grace had come to her house that Saturday, why hadn't she told Amora? And if there was an argument, with whom? Her mind flickered to James, but she dismissed the thought. He had been home that weekend, hadn't he? "Are you sure it was my house?" Amora asked, hoping for some mistake. "I'm certain," Mrs. Odelai said, her tone resolute. "She was carrying a bag when she went in, but she didn't have it when she came out." She looked upset, "Amora." "I tried to call out to her, but she just waved and left quickly." Amora's grip tightened on the doorframe. A faint chill ran through her despite the warm afternoon Sunday. "Thank you, Mrs. Odelai. I'll look into it." The neighbor patted her arm gently. "If you need anything, dear, you know where I am." Amora nodded and closed the door, leaning against it as her thoughts swirled. Her mother had been at her house, and something had happened, something that left her upset enough to leave without her bag. She turned back to the duffel bag and the dead phone, her unease deepening. Pieces of the puzzle were beginning to surface, but none of them fit together yet. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and that knot in her stomach tightened as a thought she didn't want to entertain pushed its way to the forefront. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was, it had started in her own home. Amora pulled into her driveway, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic loop. Mrs. Odelai's words echoed in her mind. She looked upset, there were loud voices, she went to your house. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the puzzle pieces weren't fitting together. Stepping into the house, the familiar scent of lavender from her diffuser felt out of place now, masking an undercurrent of unease. She closed the door quietly behind her and called out, "James. Are you home?" "In the office," came his muffled reply. She set her bag down on the counter and stood still for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. James didn't sound his usual composed self. His voice was tense, clipped. Gathering herself, she walked toward his office. The door was shut, but she knocked lightly. "Come in," he said after a bit, his tone almost reluctant. Amora pushed the door open to find him seated at his desk, typing on his laptop. His face lit up in a strained smile. "Hey, back already? How's your mom?" Her stomach tightened. She wasn't there. James's fingers froze over the keyboard for the briefest moment before he resumed typing, though now his pace seemed slower, more deliberate. "Really? Where'd she go this time?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Amora replied, her voice sharper than she intended. James's hands stilled completely now, and he turned to face her. "What's that supposed to mean?" She crossed her arms, holding his gaze. "Our neighbor, Mrs. Odelai, said she saw Mama at our house last Saturday." She mentioned there were raised voices. James frowned, his jaw tightening slightly. "Mrs. Odelai needs a new hobby. She probably heard the TV or something. She said Mama looked upset when she left," Amora pressed. "And that she didn't have her bag with her when she walked out." James exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Amora, I don't know what she's talking about. Your mom hasn't been here in weeks. If she was upset, it wasn't because of me. You don't remember her coming here? Not even last Saturday." Amora's voice wavered. "Amora," James said, his tone softening, "I swear, if Grace was here, I didn't see her. Maybe she stopped by when I was out." Amora studied his face, searching for cracks in his calm exterior. He met her gaze steadily, but there was something in his eyes, something evasive, as though he were choosing his words carefully. As James returned his attention to his laptop, Amora's mind drifted to moments she hadn't thought much about before but now felt significant. Mama Grace had always been warm toward James, but she had a way of watching him, almost as if she were waiting for him to slip up. There was the time they were discussing Amora's inheritance. Mama Grace had asked James, casually but pointedly, "You're not planning on touching her savings, are you?" James had laughed it off, but his voice had a sharp edge when he replied, "I don't need Amora's money, Grace. I make enough of my own." Amora had brushed it off then, chalking it up to a clash of personalities. Mama Grace had always been protective of her, sometimes to a fault. But now, the memory seemed heavier, more loaded. Then there was the time Mama Grace had directly accused James of hiding something. They had been at a family barbecue, and Amora overheard her mother saying, "Secrets have a way of coming out, James. You do well to remember that." James had laughed again, but his tone was tight, almost mocking. Later that evening, when Amora asked him about it, he dismissed it. "Your mom has a wild imagination. She probably thinks I'm running some sort of mafia," he'd said, rolling his eyes. At the time, it seemed absurd. Now, it didn't. Back in the present, Amora snapped out of her thoughts to find James staring at her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice too casual. "I'm fine," she lied, turning toward the kitchen. "Just tired." As she busied herself with tidying up the counter, she couldn't help but notice James's subtle movements. He glanced at his phone on the desk, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. He looked tense, far from his usual composed self. "Working on something important?" she asked, nodding toward his laptop. "Yeah," he replied without looking up. "Client project. Got a deadline." She walked closer, leaning on the doorframe. "What kind of project?" "Amora," he said, finally looking at her, his smile tight, "You know I can't discuss work stuff." "Right," she said, nodding slowly. "Just wondering." He returned to his screen, but she caught the way his shoulders stiffened. It wasn't like him to be so guarded, not with her. A few minutes later, James stood abruptly, shutting his laptop. "I'm going to grab a shower," he said, his voice clipped. As he walked past her, she noticed him pocketing something, a small key, barely visible, but enough to catch her eye. Her heart thudded in her chest. Was it for the locked trunk in the basement? After James disappeared into the bathroom, Amora made her way to his office. The laptop was locked, the screen displaying a password prompt. Her hands itched to try and guess it, but she knew better. Instead, her eyes scanned the desk for any clues. She noticed a drawer slightly ajar and pulled it open. Inside were papers, bills, receipts, and a few envelopes. One of them caught her attention. It was addressed to her mother, the handwriting unmistakable. She pulled it out and unfolded the note inside. It was short but enough to send chills down her spine. "We need to talk. Stop interfering. It's not your concern." Her hands trembled as she folded the paper and placed it back in the drawer. The note, combined with James's odd behavior, the locked trunk, and her mother's disappearance, painted a picture she wasn't ready to confront. But denial wouldn't help her now. Her stomach churned as the sound of running water stopped. James would be out of the shower soon, and she couldn't risk him catching her snooping. Quickly, she closed the drawer and left the office, her mind racing. As Amora sat at the kitchen table, pretending to scroll through her phone, she felt James's presence as he entered the room. He kissed the top of her head, as he always did, but this time, it felt hollow, mechanical. "I'll be working late tonight," he said casually, grabbing his briefcase. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. Her eyes followed him as he walked out the door, her heart sinking with every step he took. The house felt suffocatingly silent once he was gone. For the first time, Amora allowed herself to admit what she had been avoiding all along. James wasn't just hiding something. He was lying to her, and whatever it was, it had something to do with her mother. The clock ticked past 8, and the house was unusually quiet. James had left for a late meeting, leaving Amora alone. The silence pressed against her ears as she sat on the couch, aimlessly flipping through channels. Her thoughts drifted, unsettled by the growing pile of unanswered questions surrounding her mother's disappearance. The nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong refused to let go. She was about to head upstairs when a muffled thud echoed through the house. Amora froze, the sound unmistakably coming from the basement. Her heart began to pound. It was likely nothing, a loose pipe, maybe the old furnace acting up, but she couldn't ignore the chill crawling up her spine. Grabbing her phone and switching on the flashlight, she made her way to the basement door. The house seemed to hold its breath as she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. With a deep breath, she twisted it open, the creak of the hinges louder than it should have been in the stillness. The basement stairs stretched below her, cloaked in shadows that danced under her flashlight's beam. She descended slowly, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder as she reached the bottom, carrying a damp, metallic scent that made her wrinkle her nose. The basement was cluttered as always, old furniture, boxes of keepsakes, and tools James insisted on keeping. But something felt different tonight, an almost imperceptible shift that set her nerves on edge. She swept the flashlight across the room, her eyes scanning the space until the beam landed on something unfamiliar. In the far corner, partially obscured by an old tarp, was a trunk she didn't recognize. Amora moved closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The trunk was large, made of metal, with a heavy padlock securing it shut. Her brow furrowed. James never mentioned bringing anything new down here. It didn't look like the kind of storage box they owned. It was industrial, weathered, and entirely out of place. Amora crouched beside it, running her fingers over its cool surface. A strange unease settled over her as she noticed scratches near the lock, as if someone had forced it closed hastily. She tugged at the lid, but the padlock held firm. Frustrated, she examined the lock closely. There was no way she'd get it open without a key or tools. As she stood up, a faint, foul smell reached her nose. She froze, her flashlight slipping slightly in her grip. The odor was faint but unmistakable, putrid, decaying, like something long gone bad. Her stomach turned, and she instinctively stepped back, her mind racing. The noise she'd heard earlier, could it have come from inside the trunk? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the smell lingered, refusing to let her push it away. Her breathing quickened as she paced the basement, her mind darting between possibilities. Could it just be spoiled food? Something James stored without thinking. But why the lock? Amora's eyes darted back to the trunk as if drawn to it against her will. She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that there was nothing sinister about it. But the oddities in her mother's disappearance, the bag left half-packed, her phone abandoned, Mrs. Odelai's remarks, kept piling up in her mind, each one pointing her back to this very moment. I need to find out what's in there, she thought, biting her lip. But how? Breaking the lock seemed extreme, especially when she didn't have the right tools. Calling the police felt equally drastic. What would she even say? That her husband brought home a locked trunk, and she didn't recognize it. Her flashlight beam faltered, the shadows closing in again as her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't ignore the smell or the pit forming in her stomach. If she waited too long, she might lose whatever chance she had to figure out what was happening. Get a grip, she muttered to herself, her voice trembling in the empty basement. She scanned the shelves, hoping for something she could use to pry the lock open, but everything seemed useless. A rusted crowbar caught her eye, but even as she grabbed it, her hands hesitated. Did she really want to know what was inside? What if the answer shattered the fragile stability of her world? Her phone vibrated in her pocket, jolting her back to the present. She pulled it out, her fingers fumbling, and saw James's name flashing on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the green button, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she say? That she was standing in the basement, staring at a locked trunk, wondering if her husband was hiding something unthinkable. The call ended, and Amora let out a shaky breath. She glanced back at the trunk, her resolve hardening. She had to know. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs made her freeze. The sound of the front door opening and closing echoed through the house, followed by James's familiar voice calling out, "Amora. I'm home." Panic surged through her. She hadn't expected him back so soon. Shoving the crowbar behind an old box, she flicked off her flashlight and hurried up the stairs, closing the basement door quietly behind her. Her heart was racing as she turned to see James walking into the living room, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey," he said, setting his bag down on the table. "What are you doing?" "Just tidying up," Amora lied, forcing a smile. She prayed her face didn't betray her unease. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Everything okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," she said quickly, brushing past him. "Just tired." As James made his way to the kitchen, Amora turned back toward the basement door. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment before she forced herself to look away. The locked trunk was still down there, its secrets sealed behind steel and suspicion. Her thoughts churned as she followed James into the kitchen, feigning no mercy. The smell, the lock, the noise, it all pointed to something sinister, something she couldn't ignore. But for now, she had no answers, only dread curling in her stomach like a living thing. Later that night, as James slept soundly beside her, Amora lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind kept returning to the trunk, the foul smell, and the growing chasm of doubt between her and the man she thought she knew. She had to find out the truth. But how far was she willing to go? Stay tuned for Watch What Happened Next. Subscribe our African Folktales channel.